Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. As you can see behind me here, I have a representative of all of the types of boards in the completed snowboard set, except for one that's over on the shelf there. And just before I get into it, I'm looking into the viewfinder here and I'm seeing, I think the camera is picking up all of this white and then trying to color shift. So if this looks kind of, you know, I look a little jaundiced maybe. If I can't fix that in post-editing, that's why it looks like this, and I may include a couple photos at the end so that you could see them under perhaps a little bit more of a corrected color scheme. People are going to ask what I did for the snow, I have no doubt. So as a very short description, I did go with the baking soda, water, white paint, glue mixture. The reason I did that was partly for cost, because I used 4 boxes of baking soda, and so there's quite a bit of soft flake snow replaced with that. But also, I like the creamy texture because the baking soda has such a fine particle size. It gave, you know, depending on how much water and solids you combine, you can play with that ratio, and it gave me a very nice foundation to overlay over, you know, cracks and seams, and, you know, to have it flow onto the ice ponds, and I really liked that effect. My only concern is that they may color shift over time. Baking soda tends to yellow, that's why you add white paint, even though they're sealed and there's snow on top of that. You know, if they should change in color over 6 months to a year, I would expect to take them back and to fix them. And I've already thought of some ways I might be able to address that should that occur. I don't know if it's going to. This is a brand new project, and so anytime I do something brand new like this, I want people to know I'll stand behind the work, and I'll be here later down the road to make sure it stays at the high quality that it leaves this shop. So I want to keep this little intro here a little short because there's a lot to look at, but the boards have all been topped with a blend of Woodland Scenic, Soft Lake Snow, and Knock Powdered Snow. That's a custom blend that I mix up that I like because it has a little nice properties for each, and that's the basics of the snow. So let's go through each of the styles of boards, and I'll give you the little ins and outs of them, and at the end I will show you the completed set altogether. So first look is just at a plain board. One of the things I think I've mentioned in a previous video is that now I'm trying to sand all the edges of the boards to ensure a more uniform thickness. The boards I've been buying lately have had a lot of irregularities in them, so I've made a very simple jig, but I'd like to improve that in the future. But I was able to sand all these edges down to a fairly tight tolerance, and when you see them all laid out together, you'll see that the seams look pretty sharp on them. They've all been sealed with a coat of matte clear coat, and there may be some spots where a little light snow might rub off, depending on how thick the powder was. You know, you might get a layer where it's not quite sealed down, but overall they've got pretty good durability and should retard you know, getting dirty too easily. What I did on many of the boards, as I had mentioned in the past, oh, that's not bad, you can see that pretty well. So I put in a few mounds on them, and again I went conservative, much like the desert boards that I showed in a recent video. Oh, this is not an injury, this is paint. I was priming some buildings last night at a friend's house. But in any case, I gave them a little, as I mentioned before, a little dusting with some blue underneath, snowed over that, and the effect is quite subtle. And I think it's appropriate. In the future, I might go for slightly larger mounds. And, oh, I should mention, originally I was using the Flex Paste to make the mounds. Flex Paste is a Woodland Scenics product. And I ran out. I used a whole jar on this project and had more to do. And so I shifted to lightweight spackle. Lightweight spackle is sort of like joint compound, but you don't mix it. It's lighter in weight and dries faster and doesn't crack. Anyway, I found that to be a suitable substitute, and so I'll probably go with that in the future, as it's quite a bit less expensive and in some ways easier to work with. So if you're going to cover it up, the lightweight spackle is not a bad way to go. So anyway, there were 7 plain boards like this, and gives you a sense of what the plain boards look like. And let's take a look at another one. This is the finished Fischer board, or ice fishers, and what I was really looking for was the snow to come up and obscure a little bit of the cuts at the edges. It didn't obscure them as much as I expected, but did tie them together overall. They've gotten in a black bottom. This is a thin sheet of styrene painted matte black that's epoxy to the bottom of the board, and that really helps to give them a sense of depth, so they drop the full 1.5 inch deep, similar to the chasm board that I have on the website as well. And I think overall they look great when they're laid out on the table, and you'll see that at the end. Especially when you look at them, you know, at a sort of a more of a model's eye view, you get that real sense of ice and drop off. And these are something that I'd be excited to take on another project in the near future, as I already have some ideas on how I might change them. But I was pretty pleased with how these came out for the set, and we'll add some nice movement variation on the tabletop as well. And here's one of the frozen lake boards. There were 4 of these. And so what I did, if you saw in the previous video, I filled it with resin that was tinted to look like ice, bringing it up lighter in color, mixing in some whites and some blues to give it a frosty look. When I gave it the matte clear coat, it knocked off a lot of the shine of it, which I wanted, because ice, there's a little gleam. You can see it's faint, but it's not pronounced. Because I'm picturing this environment as extremely cold. The customer sent me several photos of natural landforms to use as inspiration, and all of these environments were extremely frigid. And when ice gets really, really cold, it's not glossy, it's more of a matte finish. So that's kind of the effect that I was looking for. One of the nice things is you can see, you know, say over in this area here, and I might play with this more in the future, but in a few spots around the edges of the lake, you can see the translucence and the subterranean, you know, land coming through at the bottom, and I really liked that. So I might play with that more in the future. One thing I got a little lucky on, and I'm glad I did, was that I actually ended up filling this and filling this. I kept trying to shift the color more towards a whitish blue, adding more white, then another coat. I did 3 coats to bring it up, and that brought it right to the lip of what I had carved for the lake to receive the resin. And that, I think, was the right end result, because when you look at it, it doesn't look like there's a pond as much as it's just part of the land. There is a slight drop-off, but it depends on which of the boards and how much that drop appears. But I think that it looks right to me, as it should be a little closer to flush rather than looking like a depression. So got a little lucky there, but that's something I'll make sure happens in the future. The last thought on these was that I actually had snow, well, there is still snow, on the ice, a dusting, and when I put the matte clear coat down, it actually knocked it down such that you can't really see it. A few areas where it was a little thicker, but you can see this isn't actually very firmly attached because it blew over and then kind of collected there. But I was hoping for a little dusting of snow in there, but I really didn't want to keep coating that with the matte clear coat over and over and over to try to stick more on there. So I've left it as it is. They have a sort of irregular, snow's been blowing over it and then melting and receding and whatever in the past, and that's how they kind of came out. But they add a nice color contrast to the full set, and you'll see that at the end of the video. And here is one of the 2 hill boards. Now you can see them snowed in. I did build up some of these areas a little more heavily before I applied the snow to give them a little bit more of a smoother transition, wrap it around a little bit on the side. And when I originally did these, I had been expecting to hang ice amongst them, and so I had left, you know, gaps and chopped out bits. Well, partly that's just the style of the carving, but I thought I'd take advantage of those. And at the end, I realized I didn't want to put ice on any of the spots on these boards because ice would imply melting, and these look so cold that I think it would feel out of place. There is one spot I have put ice, and I'll show that in just a few minutes. So what I ended up doing then instead was just dusting some of the flat areas with snow, and to give them, you know, the sense that snow has been collecting on them, but otherwise left them pretty much as is. There was some discussion early on in the project about adding foliage or scrub bushes or, you know, wiry things laying around. And again, none of the photos showed any vegetation of any kind. It had a glacial appearance, and plants don't grow on glaciers. So I decided to avoid that and leave them without any plants. And I think in the end, that works a little bit better to make it look actually a little bit colder. With the addition of some bones, which you'll see in a few minutes, there are some other kinds of things to make there, some visual interest on the boards that would be what normally the plants would take the place of. So that gives you a sense of one of the hill boards. And this is the second hill board. Now, before we talk about that corner, just to show the actual landform here, this was the hill. I was a little concerned about it looking a little too, squarish in some of the spots. So I actually went back in and added several layers of foundation underneath here so that I could pile the snow up in these spots. And I think that really helped to break that up a little bit. And it just doesn't look quite so regular in shape, and wasn't, unreasonably difficult to do. Piled up a little bit more in this area, and anyway, I think that helped tie them together quite a bit better. And I like the idea of them, of there being several platforms. I like overall the layout of this kind of a structure. So this is something I'll probably be emulating more in the future. I think this has a total height of around 2 inches at this point. Most of the surface is relatively flat, but you might have a little trouble holding a couple individual models on some spots on the slope. But I tried to take it as gradual as I could with the space provided so that it would still be a functional hill as well. And in the corner you see the dragon skull. This was a late addition to the project. Customer had seen this when we were discussing dinosaur bones online, and he thought that this might be a fun addition. This is a resin miniature terrain piece produced by Secret Weapon Miniatures. Comes pretty much just as you see it, of course not painted. And what I did is I decided that it might be a good addition. Let's go for it. And once I set it down, I decided to put it next to the hill because it is so large. It stands quite tall. It's got a lot of weight to it, and I think the hill helps to balance it a little bit rather than sticking it on a plain board all by itself would kind of look like it's out in the middle of nowhere. The eye sockets, while they're potentially a little tipped back for realistic anatomy, did provide a kind of a nice spot to fill with snow. But again, I didn't put any ice on it, not thinking there's a lot of melting. If any snow disappears, it's probably through sublimation. Snow can evaporate. Anyway, so that's kind of how I went with this. I was a little concerned about the nostrils because they're not very deep actually in the model itself. And I realized when I started to work on it that putting a little snow in there took care of that problem about whether to paint them black, make them look like they really are deep, how to put snow in them. Just filled them up, and that kind of worked out all right. So that gives you a little sense of what the Secret Weapon Dragon Skull looks like. You can find this on their site in their terrain section. So that's the second hill board. And this is the what I'm calling the bone board. The customer, after we were talking about, I showed those dinosaur models that I was going to use, the sort of enhanced toys, let's call them, and I showed them to the customer, and the customer liked them, and I thought we'd be putting a bunch, scattered around on the boards, and he said, no, I don't want a boneyard, I just want one. And I said, oh, okay. And they said, don't make it dinosaur-like. He wanted more of a fantasy feel to it, so things like the stegosaur was out, and made me go through the bones and think about what could I pick out that would give a good feel but not look too dinosaur-like. What I ended up doing here is I picked out the Tyrannosaurus Rex body, hence the little front legs, and disassembled that only included one leg, one front arm, took apart all the toes, you know, spread them out, slumped some snow up, oops, let's see here, I'm going a little fast there, up against the tail, buried the end of the tail here, and then to make it look a little different, I actually used the Stegosaurus skull. And because the T-Rex skull is so recognizable in our culture, you see a T-Rex skull, you know it's a T-Rex. And you see the stegosaur plates, and you know it's a stegosaur. You know, same with like a triceratops, things like that. There's these icons of dinosaurs in our culture. But I felt like with just these few body parts and just that skull, it looks unfamiliar, and I really like how this piece came out. I slumped up some snow, you know, in the back of the backbone there, pushed some up on this side of the skull. I debated about whether to tip the skull sideways or have it upright. In the end, I decided I liked it upright, give something of a little bit more of a shift in plane from the rest of the body's layout. You know, buried the arm, and just really liked overall the feel that this gave. You know, it just goes to show that something that looks like it's usable can come out looking, I think, pretty good if you take the time to do some major modifications to it to add a little bit of realism. So just a few of those bones cut up. I will say this plastic is hard to cut. Painted up, and then laid in the snow, and it gives a very, very nice effect. So you'll see when I shoot the whole board set how this looks proportionally to the rest of the layout, and I think it fits it really, really well. And this was one of the last pieces to be created. A customer originally requested a cave, but in our initial discussions didn't indicate anything about its size. And once I discussed in the video previously, this is the back video thumb, I mentioned, you know, carving it into one of the hills and making it kind of small, maybe some kind of monster entrance or something like that. And he said, no. He'd like it to be wide enough to accept two 25mm based miniatures and at least 3 inches high. So that meant I had to build a really large structure to set it into. I'm not sure exactly the height on this. Wait a minute, I have a tape measure. So, from the table, it's 6 inches. Take 1.5 inches off of that for the board. So it's 4.5 inches high. Yeah. And the entrance is just under 3. Well, I think it's just about 3. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. 3 to the front if you don't count the icicles. And I went with something about 3 inches wide in the interior. And the customer mentioned maybe adding some bones around the outside of it to look like, you know, some denizen in there is feeding on them. And the nice thing is this is big enough you could, you know, presumably say a dragon lives in there or something even like that. This was a real challenge, though, to fit on a 20-inch board. To get the proportion, you know, of surrounding material to house an opening that large meant I really had to push it to the very edge of the board on both sides. But I didn't want the opening to have a symmetrical shape because that just really looks artificial. So what I decided to do was try to bring this side down as much as I could, bring it down to a taper. This is not really, you know, stable for miniatures, but, you know, just visually I thought that was important. And then on this side, carve in a cliff face that wrapped around with, you know, a slope coming up to the cliff face so that the cliff face has an angled rise as it goes towards the back. So we're looking at, you know, the most prominent extension of a larger landform going off the table. And I think overall that came out really well. I'm really, really pleased with this side. This corner, I like this corner. I don't know, go figure. And what I did here, again, is I took some bones, cut them up so that they'd be unrecognizable. These are actually from, I think, the Triceratops kit. And put in a couple, you know, large leg bones, a few bones. This is, you know, some of the foot bones and vertebrae and, you know, part of the hip in here. And, of course, the rib cage. You got to have a rib cage. It just looks awesome. And anyway, stuffed those in, snowed on them, and then I wasn't really sure how to handle the entrance. The customer was indicating that he'd like to use this with Dwarven Forge possibly. So what I did is I cut the back to be the height of a Dwarven Forge, dungeon piece, so that when you push the Dwarven Forge up against it, it will sit flush. But I wasn't really sure how to finish this interior. So what I did, just as a simple fix, was just gradually bring snow like it's been blowing in way into the interior of the cave, and left it pretty much as that. But on the inside walls, I just took that carving. Hopefully that's not in too much shadow. And I just took the carving and basically just wrapped it around. I had to do that in 2 sections, and then paint them in 2 sections, and then glue it. But luckily, because of the striations, I have a friend who says I say stratified a lot. See, striations, word choice, variation. That really masks the seam really well, so you can't even see it at all. And lastly, I thought this would be the one place where I could put in some icicles. He had sent me a photo of a cave that had a lot of icicles hanging in it. And I thought that at least in I always need plausibility. And so what I decided to say was that perhaps internal heat from within the cave is constantly melting snow, above it. And it's, trickling very slowly through these cracks in the stone and forming icicles. So I could put in a few here, and I carried them into the cave in a few successive rows. And let's see if I can give you, it's a little tough because the board will prevent that. But you can see some on the interior as well to try to give it that sense that, it's seeping literally out of the rock. Not as prominent as I had hoped. It's hard to tell until it dries, but I did rub a little, ice onto the sides here with a couple little drips, and a little bit on the side on the inside here. It doesn't show quite as much as I would have liked, so maybe next time I might do that a little more aggressively. But kind of breaks it up and gives it a unique feel on the table, something, as a focal point for the setting. That is functional for play, but it's nice that it's pushed to the side because it is a large piece, so it's not going to mess with gameplay too much. So that is the last of the types of boards on the set. And last, but certainly not least, the customer requested several sets of conifers to be added to the set with snow on them. Now, you can buy some conifers that look a little bit like this with snow on them. TerranScapes sells some. But I thought it would be an important consideration to have it match texturally and otherwise to the boards themselves, and certainly to match to these trees, because you can't have these trees pre-purchased with snow, because these have to be hand-built. These are basically Woodland Scenics armatures, with all the foliage added to them. So what I did is I assembled the trees, gave these a quick sealing spray with some PVA and water to give them a little rigidity, and then with some successive downward brushing, painted on some of the snow mixture, and then gave them a sprinkling of snow on the top. And I think it really gave them a nice look. I'm actually more pleased with how they came out than I expected. I wasn't really sure, as I haven't done this kind of heavy snowing on trees in the past. I've just done sprinkle, seal. But I wanted some of those really bright white patches to collect on the tops and to collect in some of the crooks of the foliage. And anyway, and what the nice thing is it also improves its durability, because that material acts as its own bonding agent and really seals them down. I left the bases unadorned, again, too cold for vegetation except for these trees. And in retrospect, perhaps I could have added in a couple fallen limbs or something similar, but there were a lot of trees to do, and there's a sort of trade-off for amount of time invested in cost. These trees are the TerranScape pre-made different styles of conifers. I put in a whole variety of trees into the set to give it a little bit more interest and variation. Again, painted it on, and then gave them some sealing, some sprinkles, and then a matte clear coat to knock that all down and seal it up tight. So that gives you a sense of how the trees came out. So at this point, we should probably take a look at all of these elements all combined together into one playing surface. So this gives you a chance to see the entire set put together. It's been a little while since I've had something new and big like this to put out on the floor and shoot a video of, so that's kind of a fun change of pace for me. But I think taking a look at the set as a whole, you get a sense that there's really a lot to look at on the table, so to speak, in terms of lots of features. And, you know, even though it's all bare snow, you don't get this overall blinding plain white platform to play on. I think having the 4 frozen lakes adds quite a bit of color to that, as you get a lot of that nice blue coming through. And of course the fissures and the hills give a nice dark contrast, so it really, I think, balances it all pretty well altogether. You know, and lastly, of course, before we take a little closer look at some of these things, you know, having a good supply of trees on it really adds a lot to it. This is 8 sets of trees total, 3 sets of the conifer 1 style, which is the trees that I build by hand, and then 5 sets of the TerranScapes trees. And with all the snow on them, again, they give a little color contrast, a little height variation, and tie it all together. And I think, you know, the customer in the end requested that I only do 1 board with the dinosaur skeleton in it, and I think that was a really nice call because, you know, it's sort of like an isolated feature on the table rather than having a whole bunch of things scattered all around, which I think would make it look a little bit too busy and kind of take away from, you know, the overall feel of it. It's personal taste, of course, you know, you could add more. But having a few of the bones around the cave and in that large dragon skull, you know, of course, again, a couple things to just draw your eye in to take a look at. So let me pop the camera off the tripod and we'll take a closer look at some of these from more of a model's perspective. So this gives you just a slightly different view of the boards, gives you a little bit of a sense of what they look like more from a gaming height, you know, that's sort of the model's eye view, if you will. I think the fissures actually came out really well, and I was a little concerned about them, but I think they work really nicely, especially at sort of game height. In fact, because they're deep, you know, you don't really see the bottoms of them very often, but if you come up and take a look at them, you know, it doesn't look out of place. And I think I just really like how that skeleton came out. Whoop, I'm a little stuck on a tree here. And gives you a little sense of what that looks like all tied together. And here's another angle of the boards with the multi-tiered hill and the skull, and of course the cave. I thought about, for photography, putting something behind the cave to make it look black, because it is so large to accommodate multiple models going through it. You know, obviously you can easily see through it, and that sort of breaks the illusion just a little bit, but it might be quite nice to look through that and then see Dwarven Forge pieces all laid out behind it, and get a sense of going through the cave into the cavern or whatever set is going to be placed behind it. So that's kind of a nice feature, actually, depending on how it's set up. And overall, I was really happy with the seams of the boards. They're, I would say they're quite tight. There's a couple spots where they sit up, you know, from each other just a little bit, but overall, many of them are good, flush edge, and I think it's about as good as I can get it, you know, doing some of the handwork here, although I've got some ideas to try to improve it. Again, you know, small amount, but was really pleased with how that came out. And it just gives you a little sense of how the boards look from, you know, a complete setup with all of the boards and all of the trees on it. I think this would work for, you know, quite a few styles of games, and provides, you know, quite a bit of variation to really affect different kinds of gameplay. So that gives you a complete look.
So as a change of pace, I thought I'd wrap this up with a few photos of the boards and let you know that these are going to go into the web store as a normal item, so they'll be on the Playing Surfaces page, so you can see them there, and those photos should be available by the time this video goes live, and that has all the ordering information if you're interested in a set. And I should also remind you that these kinds of boards can be integrated, in various ways into the other board sets and vice versa. So if you want a dino board on a, in a Martian set or something like that, that can always be arranged. So don't feel like each one is segregated to its own section. So hopefully you enjoyed taking a look at these boards, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below as always. And keep your eye on the channel. Might be just a little bit before I get the next video out, but I have some new projects coming up, and one will be quite different from something that I've done in the past. Well, not super, but a little different. So keep your eye on the channel for that. And once again, thank you as always for taking the time to join me. It does mean a lot, and I appreciate it.